Hi, it's Make It Month 12, and this month we are looking at casting. So far we've made little balls. I'm scared to say that word again after Kernowcraft's video. All my students have been saying balls all week as well. So we started off just by melting silver on flat surfaces, which isn't really casting, but it's just a nice introduction to melting metal down, and it's something that can be done with small torches and without any sort of specialist equipment at all. But next up we're going to be doing the more common version of casting, which is where you melt metal in something and then pour it into or onto something else, so it takes on the shape and texture of that thing that you pour it onto. So to be able to melt the metal in something, we need a crucible, and crucibles come in lots of different shapes and sizes, which I'm going to show you next. I've got them in front of me. Crucibles are normally made from ceramic. It's normally a ceramic dish, and when you first get them, they're nice and clean and white like this, but this is actually the back of mine because in reality it looks like this. So it's got this dark glaze in it. This is quite a big one. You can get teeny tiny ones as well, but can you see they all have this dark glaze in them? And they don't come like that. It's like woks in certain pans, you need to season them before use. So the glaze is actually just borax, so what we've been using for the soldering so far. And you can either use a borax cone, this is all that's left of mine in a minute, and grind it up and put it into your crucible, or you can use borax powder mixed with a bit of water in your crucible as well. I can't actually show you me doing it because I don't have a new crucible to give it a go with, but basically you just take your crucible, you put some borax in it and you heat it until the borax turns to that glassy residue, which you'll have seen when you're doing your soldering. And the more you use it, the more builds up. And the borax is there just to help the metal flow. So again, exactly the same. You're using a flux and you need it to help the metal flow, and the metal becomes liquid to help it go properly liquid, so that it's going to pour nicely rather than sort of struggling to heat up. And again, it's exactly the same as when we do the soldering. So the solder won't flow unless you've got your flux, or specifically in this case your borax, there to help the metal do what it needs to do. So like I say, we just put some borax into it, you heat it until you build up a glassy residue. They come in lots of different shapes and sizes, different holders. So I'm going to talk you through them now. This is one of the most common cheap ones. So it's quite bowl shaped, it's quite round, fairly large. And then the holder is this little springy bit of metal. So you squeeze it, you can take it out. But when you hold it gently, it just grips it. So very similar to cross action or reverse action tweezers, the heat insulated ones that we use for soldering. This hasn't got any heat insulation on it, so it's a really good idea to wear a glove, but usually it doesn't get too hot, but I just wouldn't guarantee that. So I'm going to talk you through some different gloves and protection that you can use in a minute as well. Like I say, that's one of the most basic options, and although you can't really see it because it's filthy, there is a little lip on it, which is where you would pour your metal. So depending on your left or right handed, you'd position the pour. Then we've got this one, so it's similar in size, but it's a lot flatter. See the difference? This one's quite domed, this one is flatter. Now what I tend to find is how quickly your metal melts is obviously partly to do with what torch you're using and how much metal you're trying to melt at any one time, but a lot of it I find is the flatter the surface area, the more oxygen can get to the metal, the more productive the flame is, the quicker things melt. Whereas the more protected something is, so if it's sat in a dome, you've got metal in a dome and you're trying to heat it up, the dome is protecting the metal and therefore it's not getting as much oxygen in, it's not getting as much heat, which I don't know in theory, because like say you've seen in the past where we build up the firing bricks around something so the heat bounces off it, so you would think this would be more productive. But if things are too tight and too many bricks, then you cut the oxygen off and it doesn't work. So as much as it is good when heat reflects off surfaces and that helps you heat things, if the shape of the surface is actually stopping airflow, and the air being able to circulate around it. It can have the opposite effect where the flame just starts being a bit spluttery. It might cut out. That can happen quite a lot where the flame just turns off but the gas is still going, and it's because the airflow has been cut off from it. It's sort of suffocated itself and switched itself off. So I prefer to use something that's got a flatter surface rather than something that has a domed surface to it. But different people have their favourites, so you just got to try them, see how you get on. We also have a teeny tiny one, and again similar to this one, it's got a nice long handle. It's good for melting small things. And again with this one, it's quite flat, so it's easy to get the heat in there and get it up to temperature. It's got a strong holder on it, so to take it out I'd have to actually turn that, whereas with this one in theory you could accidentally, especially if you're a bit tense, start holding on for dear life, and then all of a sudden the crucibles come loose because you're squeezing the holder. I'm sure you've all had it with the reverse action tweezers where you accidentally squeeze them because you're feeling a bit tense and your work that you're holding falls out. If that was to happen with this, that would be a lot more dangerous, so you do need to make sure that you're not accidentally squeezing it really tight. Whereas with these two, let's say there's little nuts and washers that hold them in place, and then if you do need to reposition where the pouring spout is, you just loosen it, turn it around. And it's partly to do with what hand you want to hold this in and what hand you want to hold the blowtorch in. And I've also got this, so teeny tiny little metal crucible, and this one isn't for melting silver or copper or any of those things. It's for pewter, so for something with a much lower melting temperature on it. You can see it's much flimsier much smaller, much flimsier than the rest of them, so this just wouldn't survive really huge amounts of heat, which these ones are designed for. So depending on what you're up to, if you want to cast lower melting temperature metals like pewter or aluminium, you might want one of these. They're only cheap, but just not for silver and the things that we're going to be doing up next. But it doesn't mean that you necessarily have to buy a crucible if you don't want to when you're first trying it out, and I'll show you an option for that in a little bit. So I've already looked at the charcoal block, and this is a magnesia block, so it's similar. It looks more like a normal soldering block, but it's very soft, feels sort of powdery. But with both of these, what you can do is you can carve your own little crucible into them. So if you can see here, this has two big holes on it and a little pouring spout, and the reason for that is sometimes I have students come to the studio where they want to try it out. They want to be able to melt down some metal at home, and they don't want to invest in all the big tools. It's maybe a one-off, or they're just doing small jobs. So I like to show people how you can sort of adapt things that you might already have just to help you do that. So with this, you'd put your metal in the recess that's been carved out, you heat it until it melts, and then when it's ready to pour, you pour it. And generally speaking, as long as you've got some gloves on and you hold it from the edges rather than near where the surface is, it's quite safe to pick it up and pour it into the mould that you're using. The downside with these is, like I say, you would have to manually pick it up, so you'd have some decent heat proof gloves on, hold it at the opposite end from where you've been melting your metal, and tip it into the mould that you're using. It's not as secure as this, so like I say, only for small jobs you still need to be really safe, and the downside is it does break down quite easily, so the longer you use it, the more the bricks sort of starts to slump, and it's almost like melting away, but melting's the wrong word because it isn't turning into a liquid, it's just breaking down. So you can normally use them for a few uses and then that's it, done. But with your charcoal blocks and stuff like that in particular, you could still use them for other things afterwards. And with the charcoal as well, I wouldn't normally pick that up and tip it. It's more just you can make a crucible and have it on a little angle, so you could put some blocks under here to support it, and then when the metal melts it rolls off into the mould that you're using. When handling hot metal, or at least moving it, you do not want to be actually handling it. Hand and skin protection. So this is called Cool Skin, and it's really good for hot things in general. It's A lot of people use them for, you know, log burners and things like that, but it is not going to be heavy duty enough if you manage to pour molten metal onto your hand. So like I say, for general purpose stuff, these are great. They're not as bulky, but it's still not going to protect you if you manage to actually pour a load of hot metal onto your skin. Whereas proper gauntlets, similar to these, are going to offer you much more protection. But the difference is, if you are vegan or you do not want to use leather products, then I'm not entirely sure what the best option is in terms of synthetic. The other downside with gauntlets is they are big and cumbersome, so I really struggle to find some that fit me, so my finger is actually there. So it actually makes it quite difficult to grip things as well. So that's something that you've got to bear in mind, because obviously you want to protect yourself as much as possible, but unfortunately sometimes the health and safety things put in line to protect you can actually make things slightly more dangerous, because if you can't grip something properly, you're more likely to drop it, and if you're more likely to drop it, you're more likely to burn yourself, or for there to be a fire starting. So you just have to take your responsibility about setting up your workspace as safe as possible. We'll go through some more things, and also deciding what personal protection clothing and equipment to put into place. But I would recommend finding something to fit and just give that little extra level of protection. The same goes for the rest of you. So you really should be wearing, again, something suitable to protect you. So this is a heavy leather apron. It's a welder's apron, and it's really thick, really heavy, so it's just going to give you that little extra bit of protection. It's really long, so it almost comes down to just above my ankles, but again, not vegan friendly. So again, if you don't want to use leather products, you might consider a very heavy denim. But things like denim is controversial because some of it has lycra and, you know, elastine in it, and anything synthetic, if you know that if you get something hot on that, it's gonna melt and catch, so that's not good. But they do reckon that a heavy cotton is one of the next best options. So it's just finding something heavy that's not going to melt if it comes into contact with heat. Same goes for having your legs covered and wearing decent footwear as well. So ideally thick, heavy leather boots or workwear boots that are flame and heat retardant. If you do manage to burn yourself, then obviously you need to deal with that straight away. You need to keep it very, very cold, or ice it depending on how cold it is. Maybe just familiarise yourself with the first aid measures and make sure you have stuff to hand in the house before having a go with this, or that you've got somebody on call to help out with stuff. And if you do this sensibly, there's no reason why you should burn yourself, but it's one of those things where, out of all the techniques we've done so far, if something was to go wrong, this is going to cause the biggest risk. So you just need to have safety measures in place, such as fire blankets and extinguishers. And also removing flammable things from the work area, because especially if you end up using the bigger torch, which I'm going to show you, it's not just where the flame is pointing, it's the whole area gets very, very hot. So if there's something that is liable to catch, or something that's liable to melt, plastic items, they all need to be removed and secured out the way to stop that from happening. And you need to make sure you know how you're going to get out of your workspace if there is an issue. So make sure that the path to the door is clear, and that you are not putting the flames and the hot area between yourself and the way you would need to get out of the building. So let's say just a few things to consider. We need to have decent eye protection as well. I can see where my goggles have gone. So at the very least, full goggles, full eye protection, or again, if you're doing this on slightly larger scale or more often, then you might want to get some welder's goggles. And lastly, before we get going with this, just before you start, have a little Google of metal fume fever. So when you melt metals, they give off fumes, so we need to have a little think about extraction and air quality. I'll show you a few different options in a little moment. But different metals are bigger culprits than others as well. And an awful lot of it, again, it just comes down to how much you're doing, how much ventilation you have in the space, how your health is in general. So if you are pregnant or if you've got health conditions, then there's a good chance that your body's going to be more susceptible to any fumes, whereas if you've got a full bill of health and just got yourself to worry about, the chances are your body, you know, can process things much easier and safer, and it won't affect you. For example, I'm asthmatic and my breathing has been bad this year because they're building across the road from us, so I know that I need to be particularly careful at the minute. Up until now, we've sometimes been seen wearing masks like this, or I have my my lion snood, which both of those options are good just in terms of, you know, larger dust particles and helping with your breathing, so that you're not breathing in loads of sort of dirty mess and dust, but they're absolutely no good for fumes. And what we're talking about at the minute is fumes. So you may want to get a fume mask. Again, these are a little bit controversial in this country. We're getting more and more used to wearing them because especially in America, seeing more American videos, they're very popular over there, and every little helps. But I'm just going to mention something else. The only problem with fume masks and particulate filters is if you need to be wearing one, the chances are there's something else that needs to be done to counteract the issues that have caused you to need to wear one. Because if you're working in a studio and you're doing something where you feel there's fumes in the air or something that's going to damage you, as soon as you take this off, those fumes are still going to be in the air. So these can be a little bit like a false sense of security. So it's even more important just to make sure that you've got good airflow or extraction or something going on, or you're just doing tiny amounts, and again with good airflow, rather than thinking I can do whatever I want, I've got this on my face, I'm going to be completely fine. Because like I say, as soon as you take this off, in theory, whatever it is you've been working with is still going to be in the air, it's just going to be slightly less noticeable. The same goes for extraction. So if you can have a proper extraction unit, that is absolutely amazing and is, you know, it's great for your health. But by a proper one, what I mean is it needs to be sucking all the air out and replacing the air as well with fresh air. So it's a two-part system, and preferably for it to be filtered as it goes out the building as well. So it's literally big things, big noisy expensive things that cost money to run, which for most home smiths, they don't have the room, space or capacity to do that. So again, where I get worried a little bit is people put other types of extraction in place and they presume that they're safe, but actually it might not really be making much of a difference. So it's just to bear that in mind as well, because like I say, every little helps. I'm not saying don't do these things, it's a good idea to do them, but just don't presume that it's stopping you from actually breathing in the fumes fully. So for example, today in the corner I have my little charcoal extractor, and it's really good at sucking up smoke and some of the fumes that come off, but it's not heavy duty, it's not going to be taking away everything. I'm going to have the door open, so that's really good about getting airflow in and out, but again, it's not going to, you know, it's not a fail-safe option. I'm in a small space, so it's definitely helpful in terms of, for me, whereas if I was in a larger space with it open, it's not going to be circulating the air quite as much. The other thing we see quite a lot is people using these overhead extractors, and they think, oh great, it's sucking all the fumes out, but if it's over your head, what it's actually doing is pulling the fumes up towards your face, so potentially making the problem worse again as well. So it's just saying for everybody to do your own research. Don't presume that just because somebody said wear this mask or do this or do that, with your precise setup that is going to help. You need to have a proper look into it and decide what you are happy to do.